All right, so for this lecture, we're shifting into structural family therapy, which is one of those foundational models that quietly shows up everywhere, even if you don't realize you're using it yet. So, this is one of the earliest truly systemic approaches. It's practical, observable, and very focused on what families are doing, not just what they're feeling or thinking. And once you understand it, you'll start seeing family structure everywhere at Thanksgiving, at Target, and definitely in session. So you're going to hear and see a lot of overlap between strategic and structural, but I think structural really kind of expanded on strategic's ideas. So the basics of structural family therapy, it's most closely associated with Salvador Minuchin. And he's one of the most important figures, and it's really important to know about him and where his model comes from. And so Mnuchin didn't start out working with wealthy, highly verbal families on couches. He began by working with low-income families, many of whom were navigating poverty, racism, immigration stress, chronic illness, and institutional involvement, like schools and courts and hospitals. And so he wasn't out there with the California group. He was actually in Philadelphia. He was working at the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic in the 60s and 70s. So he came a little bit after Jay Haley's strategic family therapy. And so what he noticed was this: individual symptoms made much more sense when you looked at the family's organization. So structural family therapy starts with the big assumption, and that's that families have an underlying organization, whether they realize it or not. And when that organization becomes too rigid or too chaotic, symptoms emerge. And so Mnuchin's background matters here because he was born in Argentina, he was trained as a physician, and he later moved into psychiatry and family therapy. And so he worked extensively with marginalized families, including families of children with psychosomatic illnesses. And so what he noticed was that traditional individual therapy often missed the point. Families weren't resistant, they were just organized in ways that once worked, but they no longer did. And so Mnuchin was influenced by systems theory, observational learning, and real-time interaction, not just stories about the past. And that's why structural family therapy is so active. The therapist doesn't just listen, they watch, they interrupt, they rearrange, and they intervene. And y'all know I'm an EFT therapist, and EFT pulls a lot from structural, pulls a lot from that. And so EFT, and when I do couples work, I'm very active. I interrupt, I rearrange, I intervene, and I tell them up front, this is not going to be socially smooth. I'm going to probably interrupt you just when you feel like you're getting going and you don't want to be stopped. And so, it's just kind of interesting to see how this classic theory informs, a newer theory that I use. EFT was developed in the 80s and 90s, so it's really new, relatively speaking. Okay, so kind of getting back on track here. All right, so this whole thing about interrupting, rearranging, all that, that's why critics sometimes describe Mnuchin as directive, pushy, or even confrontational. But, from his perspective, families need movement, not just insight alone. And that's, when my couples work too, is that I tell them I'm going to be a lot more active than, what you might have experienced in the past. I'm not just nodding my head and agreeing with everything you say, right? Not that that's what you should be doing anyway, but, some counselors are out there doing that. So, anyway, focusing on the key ideas of structural family therapy. So, the family structure is a set of rules, and not rules like we don't run in the house, more like rules of like how, if we're angry, are we allowed to be angry? If we are angry, how do we express that anger? Things like that. Those unspoken family rules. Repeated interaction evolves into expectations. They always act like this. I'm going to go ask dad because he'll say yes. Mom always says no, right? So, kind of that kind of thing. So the family structure. You've got subsystems, and subsystems are just, it's just like little mini systems within the greater family system. So it might be based on sex and gender. So maybe all the girls, kind of have their own thing going on, and all the boys have their kind of thing, whatever. Generation, it could be, the parents kind of stick to themselves and the kids are all kind of in their own subsystem. It could be based on interests, maybe one of the parents likes to go hunt and fish, and there are a couple of the kids that enjoy doing that. And so that's kind of their subsystem. They always go do that, but not everybody has to, and that's okay. And then also function and role. Like, what are your roles? Like, are you the caretaker? Are you the troublemaker? Are you that kind of thing? Then we look at boundaries, and boundaries can be generational. And we're looking at how permeable are they? And that just kind of is a fancy word for boundary flexibility. And then they have structural describes this idea of diffuse versus rigid boundaries. And diffuse is when you're just too enmeshed, there's not really clear boundaries. And rigid, of course, means rigid. And that means, that you're cold and it's unchanging and it lacks responsiveness. And so then you'll see here power and hierarchy. Again, we're borrowing from strategic family therapy and looking at those hierarchies, like who's in charge and things like that. So those are some of the key ideas. Problems arise when kids function like partners, parents function like children, boundaries blur across subsystems. That's when, that's when a structural family therapist says this is what's causing problems. This is problematic. So these key ideas are important. And then, another note on boundaries, family rules for managing distance, closeness and distance. And so we're looking at boundaries among individual family members and then also between subsystems. A lot of times you're looking at the subsystem of parents and children, those two subsystems and what those boundaries are like. And then between the family as a whole and the extended family and non-family systems. So you think about a family might be really enmeshed and really kind of like overly involved with each other, but they have a really rigid boundary around them. And so they're not involved with their community, their school, their church, anything. They don't let others come over and hang out. That's not the place to be. So there's really rigid boundaries around the family as a whole, but maybe the family within that, they're just really enmeshed. So you can have both at the same time, just kind of depending on what level you're looking at. And also you got to consider cultural considerations, right? Always looking at that. Like what is acceptable, quote unquote, normal, given the context that the family, comes from. And so, closeness and boundaries, I always like to include this picture of porcupines because they huddle together to stay warm, right? A porcupine to survive and stay warm. But if they get too close, they're going to poke each other with their quills and they'll hurt each other. But if they're too far away, they're going to get cold and freeze and not feel good either. And so they have to find that sweet spot of just the right amount of closeness, but also the right amount of distance so nobody gets hurt. So I think porcupines is a really good metaphor for healthy boundaries. So, um, yeah, I think that's all I want to say there. All right, so looking at alliances, coalitions, and triangles. So alliances and coalitions are basically the same thing, but alliances are good and coalitions are bad in structural family therapy. Okay, that's just the boil it down simple to remember. But alliances are temporary, flexible, and generally beneficial to all family members. But coalitions are rigid, often cross-generational, and maintain family equilibrium at someone else's expense. So a classic example is when one parent aligns with a child against the other parent. So this you see this a lot in divorce. So the excluded person, often the child or the less powerful adult, frequently becomes the identified patient. So structural therapists don't ask what's wrong with this person. They ask what role is this symptom playing in the family structure. And so healthy families are not perfect, they're just adaptable. Nobody's expecting perfection. It's just adaptability and flexibility. All right, so as always, we're looking at the theory of development, very similar to what we've already talked about. Structural family therapy views families as moving through predictable stages, couple formation, families with young children, families with adolescents, and families with grown children. Starting to sound familiar, right? Overlap. But each stage requires reorganization. That's what the focus is with structural. Symptoms often appear when old rules stop working, power isn't renegotiated, or boundaries don't shift with development. So transition points are high risk moments. I mean, can you imagine now if your parents still treated you like you were 10 years old or 5 years old? Or if you were 16 years old being treated like a 5 year old, or even if you were being treated as a 16-year-old now. So those rules and those boundaries, all that has to constantly be renegotiated within the family context. And that is healthy. And we have run into problems when we have a hard time adjusting and renegotiating. So, health and dysfunction. So, Mnuchin believed that problems live in relationships and not people. That's a common theme with all this, right? Dysfunction shows up when boundaries are too rigid or lacking in responsiveness, or they're too diffuse and they lead to a lack of autonomy. And then there's scapegoating or detouring, and that often emerges to stabilize the system and distract from marital or parental conflict. So, if my husband and I have a child named Sally, and my husband and I are having lots of problems, well, it might be a lot easier to focus on Sally's shortcomings. Well, Sally really, Sally's really having a hard time. Let's just focus on Sally. And that would be scapegoating. We're detouring our problems to Sally, and we're not focusing on our own stuff. And so a healthy family has clear roles, flexible boundaries, and a leadership where it belongs with the parental unit, right? The hierarchy. So assessment and what the therapist watches here. So structural assessment happens in real time. The therapist watches who speaks first, who interrupts, who looks at whom, and who answers for whom. You like that correct grammar there? But you're just watching how they interact, even where they sit, how they sit in session can clue you in. And some key questions to include, who's the spokesperson, who speaks for the family and why? And then who is the true executive of the family? Like who made the appointment? Who makes sure everybody gets, to the appointment? And what other members are doing while one person talks. So is everybody attentive to when a family member talks, a certain family member talks? Or, maybe the teen is playing on their phone, maybe the kids, acting out and being goofy and trying to be like a little class clown, what kind of emerges uh, in that structure right there in front of you in the session. And so families reveal their structure without even realizing it. So I look for that with couples too. When I always ask you, when I meet with a couple and I'll say, what brings you in? The first person who talks or the first person who says, well, why don't you tell them? I always talk. That's the person who is typically the pursuer. And that's good information to have because that's, going to inform how you work with them. So, all right. So roles of the client and counselor. Let's see where we are here. This is one of those classic models. So of course the therapist is the expert. But Mnuchin he had this term called joining. So you're observing, but you're also engaging and you're kind of joining in their system and getting in their dynamics, participating in their dynamics. And so you also develop a sense of how your personal qualities can help families change. And I don't know if you remember back in that intro class that you took first semester with me, and we talked about the it factor and like, what is your it factor? Maybe it's a sense of humor, maybe it's a gentle and calmness you have in your presence, whatever your it factor is. This was an idea that came from Mnuchin. And so it's just kind of fun to tie it back when, things across classes kind of go together. So, but he kind of came up with that and the whole idea of joining a family system. All right, so some of the therapeutic techniques, structural therapists are definitely active participants. They're not neutral observers. Some of those core techniques include enactments, tracking interaction sequences, and that's sort of like, okay, then what do you do? And then what happens? And then what happens next? That would be tracking interaction sequences. And then who chimes in? And then what does so and so do? And then if when they do that, what do you do, right? Boundary making is another one. It's like by rearranging, you can, rearrange seats in session. I've even done this in class sometimes. It's been a while since I've done it, but I'll just say, hey, everybody get up and sit somewhere different, sit by somebody new, just when the dynamics feel off. So boundary making in session would rearrange the seats or separating subsystems, unbalancing by temporarily siding with one member. I do this in couples therapy because it's just naturally going to happen to try to you might side with one member, but that's going to create a rupture. You've got to know that's going to create a rupture with others in the room, so with the other partner. And so you have to come back and repair with validation and empathy. And so, but that temporary unbalancing, right? That temporary siding, that comes from Mnuchin's structural family therapy. And then of course reframing, y'all know what that is, and achieving intensity by staying with the moment. We call that heightening in EFT. You're wanting to have the intensity of the emotion felt in the session. So EFT really pulls a lot from structural, interestingly enough. And then using directives like from strategic that we mentioned earlier, some of those directive and non-directive directives. kind of gets all tongue-tied there. But yeah, very similar to strategic. And then stroke and kick, I think my next, yes, my next. So stroke and kick. So let's see, where are my notes here on that one? So one classic technique is called stroke and kick. So for example, telling a parent that they're very helpful, speaking for their child, and then asking when their child ever gets their voice back, kind of with a little kick, the little sarcasm. I put the little Sour Patch Kid here to kind of highlight that. Sweet at first and then a little sour at the end. I think Sour Patches are sour at first and then sweet. Right. But anyway, like the example here says, mom, you're very helpful. When did she ever give it back? Or when did you, or if you see kind of like enmeshed relationships. So, okay, mom, when did you marry your son? If the boundaries there are a little too enmeshed, or just using sarcasm, really use of sarcasm. It's not my style. That's not kind of, but maybe it's yours. And it was Mnuchin's. It worked for Mnuchin. So, um, all right. Enactments. So enactments, this is a big one that we use in EFT that we've pulled from Mnuchin, but enactments they're central to structural family therapy. The therapist may say, why don't you talk to each other and not to me, or show me what happens next. And really, an enactment is, the way I use it is I'll have one partner's kind of telling me how they feel and what their experience is. And the other partner's over here looking like, I didn't know this. I've never heard this. So I'll say, okay. And I'll help them get really clear on that emotional signal. And I'll say, why don't you turn and tell your partner, lock eyes. I know they just heard you tell me, but it's different when you lock eyes and you say it directly to the person and they kind of laugh and they feel silly. But when they do it, usually, it can be pretty powerful. So enactments are really essentially just having them not talk through you, but talk to each other instead. And so the goal isn't performance, the goal is clarity and connection. And so by slowing interactions down, the therapist makes the structure visible and it creates opportunities for change. And so that's the point of enactments in structural family therapy. So structural family therapy in action, I'm going to save this video for when we're in class together. It's just like a little mock session of structural family therapy, but it's kind of goofy, but it's a really good example of it. And so we're going to watch it and analyze it and discuss it together in class. All right. So, the evaluation of the theory, structural family therapy has strong clinical utility and some research to support it, obviously. And so it's practical and effective with complex families. But critics argue that the therapists can feel too powerful or judgmental and culturally narrow. Modern structural therapists tend to integrate cultural humility and collaboration with more intentionality. And so there's still like with all of these older theories, it's a little narrow, but it's been expanded upon, and there are ways to use it. And I use a lot of these techniques and approaches in the work that I do. So um, that's just some of the critiques. And then, as you're watching This Is Us, pay attention to who holds the power, where the boundaries blur, which subsystems might be misaligned. Um, is there any kind of enmeshment going on, or what boundaries look a little more diffuse, what look a little more rigid? Pay attention to those things as you're watching episode 3 of This Is Us so we can talk about it in class. It gives you x-ray vision. Structural family therapy, it gives you x-ray vision. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You'll see it everywhere with all families and structures. And so this is a really interesting one. It's a fun one. And so just a couple of reminders and to-dos. Read chapter 3. That's what this lecture was on, chapter 3 in structural family therapy. And then watch episode 3 of This Is Us and keep those key ideas in mind as you watch that episode. And I would encourage you to jot down little notes just so you'll have your little talking points ready for class. And so it's, again, not perfection's not expected, just curiosity and conversation and just to get your wheels turning and to sharing ideas. Okay. And just trying to make it a little bit more fun. But as always, I appreciate you listening and I look forward to seeing you in class.